Darker Pastures is a prairie gothic horror anthology and contains scenes and themes which some listeners may find distressing. For specific content warnings, please always be sure to check the episode notes and listen at your own discretion. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoy today's humbly hideous offering. Episode 53, Boys. All the ride to school, Scott Kerwood imagines the admiring expressions on the faces of his classmates when they see his new bike. A beautiful Schwinn black Phantom. Even now he can hardly believe that his parents gave him the Phantom for his birthday. He has, until now, always had to make do with hand-me-downs from his older brothers and sisters and cousins. Why they chose his 13th birthday, out of all of them, to spoil him, he cannot guess, but he also does not care to question it too much, out of a primitive, unelucidated superstition that it might cause the blessing to be snatched away. He crests a hillock, and to the east, beyond the surrounding fields of corn and wheat and beans, verdant with spring growth, the little 2-room brick school building appears. Already some of the students stand clustered on the playgrounds, passing the wait for school's start, in raucous conversation and spontaneous, tenuous play. Seeing the others, Scott pedals faster, relishing the ascendant mechanical whirring of the bike's workings beneath him. As he nears the playground, he marks with a proud grin that some of the children have stopped and begun to point in his direction. This fulfillment of his hopes, however, is soured by 3 of the faces he spots, unusually having joined the early crowd. The similarly round, fleshy, and dull-eyed countenances of the Crail brothers. All of them are like miniature versions of their father, Willard Crail, a giant of a man at over 6.5 feet tall, with arms like young oaks and a broad barrel chest. And also like their father, their dull gray eyes, too small for the faces they are set in, gleam with an overflow of piggish cruelty. As Scott slows to a stop in front of the school building, the other children gather around him, shouting words of admiration and surprise, and more than a few of jealousy. Scott grins through it all, answering with barely concealed elation. But all the while his eyes keep drifting back to the Crail brothers, who linger at the edge of the crowd. From the set of their mouths, he can see that they are as interested as the others, but share none of the other children's joy at the beauty of the new bicycle. An unpleasant sweat begins to ooze from Scott's palms and the small of his back, one that has nothing to do with the warm May morning, and he suddenly wishes that the teacher would arrive and open the front doors. He slowly works his way through the crowd toward the bicycle stand, a crude thing carved from an old cottonwood trunk, and ensconces the front tire into one of the deep slots carved into the wood, alongside 2 other bicycles of decidedly older and less costly vintage. More children arrive, alone and in small groups, mostly on foot, After 7 minutes, Miss Bolton emerges from the schoolhouse, having arrived earlier this morning to finish grading papers, and she beckons the children to line up for the start of the school day. As they slowly file inside, Scott spares a backward glance at his bike, feeling loath to leave it behind. The oldest Crail, Boyd, catches his eye and returns a slow smile, toothy with malice. Boyd, Mac, and Vinnie Crail, aged 15, 14, and 13, are known widely in the county as the resident hooligans, tormentors of smaller and more timid children, and prematurely bulky enough to intimidate peers and even adults, if their father's reputation was not enough to do so already. There are rumors that Willard Crail, their father, beats all of them, and their mother too, in ways that do not always show, and maybe that he does worse. Certainly he is a man of violent temper, and this temper is made worse by the savage headaches and back pain he frequently suffers, which the army examiners attributed to a weak heart when he was rejected for military service. That he, unlike so many men of his age, did not serve in the fight against Japan and Germany seems to rankle Willard, and with every mention of the war, his fleshy pale lips tighten, his small eyes narrowing to slivers. Once, when drunk at the little local dive known as Gary's Inn, he beat Farron Hollander, a former P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, half to death over some slight that only Willard himself perceived, an outburst that landed Willard in the county jail for several weeks, with talk of real prison time. Yet somehow he escaped real consequences, as the Crails always seemed to manage. This evil fortune held for his sons, too, even when, in '49, they ambushed poor Billy Emmons, whose polio-ravaged legs obligated him to wear heavy braces and walk with the aid of crutches on his way home from school. Hiding behind a bulky, ancient bur oak alongside the road which Billy always took home, the three boys had leapt out with homemade slingshots as he passed by, launching marbles and rocks and even bearing balls at Billy until he lay in the road, bleeding and barely conscious and permanently blind in his right eye. Though all of the children of the county knew, and most of the adults suspected who was responsible for the attack, Billy was too terrified to ever identify the culprits to his parents or even the sheriff's deputies, and so the Crails had gone unpunished. Within a year, the Emmons family had moved away to live with relatives in Iowa. All of this runs through Scott's mind as he sits at his desk, unable to focus on his schoolwork, or on Miss Bolton as she speaks before the blackboard. The Crail boys, all long since forced to sit at the front of the classroom, occupy his field of vision, no matter how he slants his forward gaze. And he dares not look away, lest Miss Bolton notice and call him up to the front of the class. Every once in a while, one of the Crails will turn to survey the other students darkly, and it seems to Scott that whenever their gazes meet, there is some unspoken promise communicated from those coldly swinish eyes. To his amazement, Scott reaches home in the afternoon without real incident. Only Vinny, the youngest of the Crayles, chanted a mocking, nursery rhyme-like farewell after him when Scott left school. Money bags, pedal on home. Don't fall off and break your bones. His older brothers did not join in, and they made no sign of intent to follow him. Putting away his bike and beginning the afternoon chores, the immediate relief of this begins to give way to a disquieted anticipation. The only cunning or planning that the Crayles have ever evidenced is always related to cruelty. And he knows that the look he saw in their faces that morning, and throughout the rest of the school day, was a sure sign of their twisted minds at work. Entering the cool dark of the chicken coop and gathering the day's bounty of eggs from their straw-lined nests, he feels again that chill, prickling perspiration beading on his neck, his palms. He considers for a moment asking his older brothers, Tom and Dave, for help, but then he remembers that Dave is in Korea, and that Tom now helps their father full-time in the fields, working sun-up to sundown, and having no time for Scott's kid troubles. His sister Sarah is married and expecting a child of her own, and Rebecca, whose health has always been a little frail, is preparing to go off to state college in the coming autumn, with dreams of becoming a school teacher herself. Scott wouldn't dare to ask a girl for help anyway, even an older one. Certainly he doesn't dream of telling his sun-browned, wind-bitten father, who is all lean muscle and hard blue eyes and silent Chesterfield exhalations, his body perpetually tense and restless ever since he returned from the battlefields of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. A small hen, unnoticed lingering in her nest, pecks at Scott's hand as he reaches in to collect her eggs. The shock of this, more of a sudden pinch than actual pain, pulls him out of his reverie, and the remainder of his tasks, slopping and watering the pigs, making sure the water bowl for the dog and the barn cats is full, drives thoughts of the Crayles from his head. He only thinks of them once more when he is done with chores and homework, when he steps outside to check over his bike, putting it in the tool shed to shelter it from the spring storm that swells in the western sky, bluing the horizon. But by then such worries seem more distant, a problem for tomorrow. Here on his family farm, surrounded by his parents and older siblings, he and the Schwinn are safe. The last week of school comes, and still nothing untoward happens, aside from the usual minor torments on the playground and after school. That Sunday, Scott lies awake late into the night, an exhausted Tom snoring in the bunk below him as he weighs the wisdom of leaving the Black Phantom at home and walking the 5 miles to and from school the final week. The lack of incident somehow aggravating rather than alleviating his trepidation. Really, he decides, it comes down to whether he is more afraid of what the Crayles will do to him or to the bike. And as he finally falls into sleep, he decides that his body will heal, but if they destroy the Schwinn, he will never get another. He dreams of a pet rabbit he's never had, In the dream, he watches from the window as a pack of wild, mangy dogs knock over the rabbit's hutch in the yard, where the bird feeder is in reality. And as though his feet are planted in molasses, he runs without real movement toward the front door as the pale, helpless creature dashes hopelessly for the fence. He opens the door only to see the snapping, frothing jaws of the mutts closing bloodily upon the rabbit's soft little body, and he awakes to the gray-blue of the early dawn. It is Tuesday, during Scott's shared math lessons with the Crayles in the late morning, that class is interrupted by a sudden, insistent knock at the door. Miss Bolton frowns at the interruption, moving to the doorway and cracking it open so that Scott cannot see the knocker. After conversing in low tones with the visitor, whose gravelly voice Scott can only recognize as male, the teacher looks back into the room with an alarmed and somber expression. Quietly, she calls to the Crayle boys and gestures them over, and the four of them step outside to talk with the newcomer. In their absence, the other school children exchange surprised and curious looks. A strange feeling is taking hold inside of Scott, like a heavy fist of ice is clenching tightly in his gut. 7 minutes tick by on the wood-framed Seth Thomas clock above the chalkboard, and some of the children begin to shift restlessly in their seats, conversing in hushed voices. Sue Ann Horowitz is sure that the Crayles are getting suspended, maybe even expelled, for what they did to Billy Emmons. Jeb Aldner says that's stupid, since the Emmons attack happened 3 years ago. But he heard they killed a kid a few weeks ago in Gresham, the next town over. Kathleen says that she heard it was a cat, not a kid, and Ken Sugihara, who is probably Scott's closest friend at school, chimes in and says his parents told him it was a dog. The whole discussion devolves into a heated and certainly no longer hushed argument. But Scott pays none of it any mind. His eyes remain fixed on the closed classroom door, ears straining to catch any stray syllable from whatever is happening outside. All of the voices fall silent as the door handle turns and Miss Bolton re-enters the classroom. Whether it is merely their heightened attention that gives the impression, or the teacher's demeanor is truly so drastically altered, Miss Bolton's walk from the door to the front of the classroom seems long and grimly dignified, like the funeral procession of some honored monarch. Reaching her desk, she places her fingertips upon the stained oak surface, like a pianist preparing to play, and leans slightly forward, staring at the stacks of papers and books before her, and taking a long, deep breath. Then, in slow and measured tones, she tells the class that Willard Crayle has passed away, and that his boys will likely not be back in school before the end of the year. The room is deathly silent then, so still that Scott can hear the blood rushing in his ears. A few of the students exchange stunned glances, and beside Scott, Sue Ann's internal conflict between excitement over the absence of the Crayles and a guilty feeling that she should respect the looming specter of death is plain in her warring features. That icy fist in Scott's abdomen feels now like it is crushing his innards, freezing him from the inside out. He glances out the westward window, which looks over the open grass field that serves as the school playground. Rolling down the dirt road at the edge of the field, he sees a black car driving away. And in the rear passenger window, he sees Boyd Crail's dullard face pressed against the glass, staring back. And even at that distance, Scott could swear he sees a smirk of satisfaction spreading across Boyd's features. By the following day, the other children already seemed to have forgotten about the spontaneous, unspoken understanding to honor the death of even a man so unliked as Willard Crail. And there is a palpably festive air in the classroom. Some of this may be due to the rapidly approaching summer break, but from the chatter among the students, the absence of the Crail boys is clearly a significant factor. Only Scott seems unconvinced that this is a certain boon. As they sit beside the little swing set, eating their packed lunches over the noon hour, Scott tries to bring up the matter with Ken, who was one of the most frequent targets of the Crail's cruelty. The Sugihara family only moved to the state a few years ago, after losing the Oregon farm they'd lived on for decades, when they were sent to the internment camps. Ken listens patiently as Scott speaks, nodding in sympathy. Yet when Scott has finished, Ken says that they're safe. The Crail boys won't be coming back, and no doubt with their father's funeral and all the farm work that will pile up in his absence, there's no way the Crails will have enough time to get up to their old misdeeds. To this line of reasoning, Scott has no real answer, certainly no argument. He shrugs, and they finish their lunch in silence, before joining an impromptu game of Red Rover in what remains of the recess hour. As much as he tries, though, Scott cannot wholly lose himself in play, cannot wholly suppress the fear that gnaws at him more with every passing hour. The morning of the last school day comes, and Scott wakes to the ever earlier sunrise. It is a bright and beautiful day, the meadowlarks, bobolinks, and robins serenading him as he retrieves the black phantom from its makeshift harbor and begins the ride to school, seeing no reason to leave it home any more, and longing to feel it run beneath him one more time before school gives way to the drudgery of summer farm work. As he has every trip to and from the schoolhouse since Tuesday, he glances across the fields toward the Crail house, which lowers from its perch atop a small hill, its unpainted timbers and dark windows reminding Scott of an old skull weathered brown. There is no sign of movement up there, not that he could see much, even if there were, and somehow that troubles him more than seeing the tiny silhouettes of the three brothers standing in the distance, perhaps one of them raising an arm in wordless threat. Then he turns back to the road and the view falls away behind him, and he forgets all about the house and the bereaved tormentors that dwell therein. At the school grounds, he and Ken handily beat the other students in a game of simplified baseball before class. And when the teacher dismisses them early at the start of the lunch hour, the general air of celebration amongst the other children, especially the ones who live in town, makes him forget all about his worries. That is, until he steps outside and sees that the Black Phantom is no longer in the bicycle rack. He finds it halfway home, lying in the tall golden weeds of the roadside ditch. The wheels are bent and the tires deflated, the seat missing, the chain and brake line snapped. The beautiful red and black paint job is scuffed and scraped, the metal body dented, as though it has been struck many times with heavy tools or perhaps large stones. Scott stares down at it for a long while. It seems to him that he should cry, or scream, or swear fumingly in the way he has sometimes heard his father do. But he does none of this. He simply stands there on the hard-packed earth of the road, feeling empty and far away. And then, slowly, something stirs in the lightless inner vacuum of his heart. A distant, cold, towering fury. One that makes his skull ache with its silent intensity. Carefully, even tenderly, he stoops to right the bicycle, trying in vain to bend the wheels back into shape, then pushing it awkwardly homeward. And all that walk, he knows that if one or all of the Crail boys were to step in his path now, he would tear into them like a cornered mother cat, without hesitation or regard for his own survival. In fact, he wishes they would appear, so that he could make them regret what they have done, even if it were only for a moment, even if it were to spell his end. Then the farmhouse of his home looms before him, and suddenly his frigid fury is gone, replaced by the dread of what his parents will say when they see the state of his costly Schwinn. He pauses at the edge of the windbreak of plums and hackberries, thinking now wildly of hiding the bicycle's gruesome remains, and simply hoping that his parents never notice. But he knows this is futile, that his sharp-eyed father will notice, and so, with a deep inhalation, he passes through the windbreak and into the elm-shaded yard. To his horror, he immediately meets his father, coming out of the tool shed with a wrench in his right hand, and oil stains on his arms. His eyes are all that registers surprise as he sees the state of the bicycle. He pauses, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of a soiled hand, then strides forward, asking what happened. There is the slight edge in his voice, subtle enough that those who do not know him well would never notice it, but which tells Scott he is upset, and Scott's insides wilt like a sun-scorched flower. I don't know. Scott lies lamely, his voice coming out as hardly more than a whimper. You don't know, his father repeats flatly. Scott shakes his head, still unable to look up and meet his father's eyes, yet nevertheless keenly aware of the man's gaze lingering upon him. "Okay, then," his father says at last, and to Scott's great surprise, the moment is over, and his father is walking back to the shade of the barn, where the Hart-Parr tractor, perpetually in need of repair, sits parked. Stunned and disbelieving, Scott wheels the ruined bicycle back into the shed, and as an impulsive afterthought, covers it with one of the canvas tarps that lies folded on the shelves. It seems somehow only appropriate, a gesture of respect for a fallen friend, and as he does so, he swears wordlessly that he will avenge it, taking the broken bike chain as a token and reminder of his oath. Then he steps back out to help his father with the farm work, as he will spend most of his days until school resumes in the fall. The first weeks of the summer break pass dreamlike, the long days of sweaty, dusty, insect-plagued field work seeming unending, and yet seeming to have vaporized instantly when the cool nights of cricket song and blessed rest arrive, which themselves pass all too quickly. His father remarks once that he is growing tall and strong, and far too quickly, and this makes Scott swell with pride. But when he lies in the bunk above Tom's, sinking slowly into sleep, the recollection of those words suddenly makes him feel wistful, and he truly realizes for the first time that childhood is finite, and that he is inexorably barreling toward the responsibilities and worries of adulthood, and that sooner than he dares to believe, life will change forever. Summer waxes, and the fields of corn and wheat, beans and millet grow tall, the greenery of the growing season beginning to turn toward the parched gold of maturity. Scott spends his days on the little Hart-Parr, working the summer fallow and contending with clouds of clinging field dust, thirsty sweat bees, and angry hornets. At night, he falls asleep to the faint buzz of the radio down the hall, as his father listens to baseball games and news reports on the war in Korea, on the growing threat of nuclear annihilation, and on Senator McCarthy's claims to have discovered a communist cabal embedded throughout the nation's highest levels. Toward the end of July, a wave of sweltering heat descends, and Mr. Kerwood allows his boys an extra hour in the midday break, and even lets them knock off early in the evening, for which both he and Tom are deeply grateful. As they sit gathered around a Thursday evening dinner, relishing the relative cool of the house interior, there is a soft, timid knock at the front door. Mrs. Kerwood answers it, and with a kindly greeting, she invites Ken Sugihara inside, and even offers him a place at the dinner table, the latter of which Ken politely declines. From the sweat staining his shirt, and the lack of any sound of arriving engine, Scott surmises that Ken must have walked the 2.5 miles here from his family's farm. Apparently arriving at the same conclusion, Mrs. Kerwood pours a glass of lemonade for the boy, and cajoles him into drinking, which he does with obvious relief. After he's drained half the glass and offered profuse words of thanks, Ken shyly broaches the reason for his arrival, asking the adults if Scott might come over and spend the weekend on the Sugihara farm, in celebration of Ken's upcoming birthday. Mrs. Kerwood shoots an appealing look at her husband, and Scott follows suit. He sees in his father's face that same strain that always comes when Ken or his family are around, a sort of thinly suppressed tension around the eyes and mouth. And he knows that when Mr. Kerwood looks at the Sugiharas, he doesn't really see them, but those young men who'd been his mortal enemies on the islands of the Pacific during the war now ended for more than half a decade. And he remembers that his father once told him, very briefly and very softly, that wars never really end for those enmeshed in them. Words which had stuck with him because his father almost never spoke of the war at all. Even so, Mr. Kerwood speaks gently to the boy, though he cannot look up from the tabletop to meet Ken's expectant gaze. And to Scott's great delight, his father says that he thinks he can spare a set of hands for a couple of days, especially given the heat. Ken, too, grins at these words, and thanks the Kerwoods profusely. Cleaning their plates and draining their glasses, Scott's father offers to drive Ken back home, and asks Scott if he wants to come along. They both readily accept, though privately Scott wonders if maybe his father asks so he won't be alone in the 41 Ford pickup, with the boy whose eyes he cannot meet. If Ken notices this, though, he is too polite to give any indication. 10 minutes later, the boys are bidding each other farewell, both excited for the coming weekend. And on the drive home, as Scott thanks his father, the man offers him a rare but thoroughly warm smile before lighting up a Chesterfield. Mercifully, and almost as though nature herself is acknowledging the rare occasion, the heat relents the following day, enough for Scott to comfortably walk to the Sugihara place. He carries his few necessities in the old leather satchel normally reserved for his school books, a hand-me-down passed along from his siblings and once used by his mother when she worked as a secretary in town. As he walks, his hands keep drifting unconsciously into the satchel. Alongside a few spare clothes and toiletries, he's stowed his broken bike chain there, having had no chance to talk with Ken about the Black Phantom's demise, and feeling a compulsion to bring the chain as tangible evidence of the crime. He smiles as the little cottonwood-shaded pond, inexplicably referred to as McGullen Lagoon by the local populace, and lying only a quarter of a mile from the Sugihara farmhouse, looms near. The previous December, he and Ken's older sister, Amy, had all skated on the frozen pond one gloriously cold but picturesque Saturday afternoon. and it was the first time he'd noticed how pretty Amy Sugihara was. A realization that had left him terrified and elated and anxious all at once. She'd always been a quiet girl, generally polite, but a little condescending toward her younger brother, and by extension his friends. But that day Scott saw a different side of her, full of playful mischief and cleverly biting wordplay, but also thoroughly gentle and warm. His smile broadens at the pleasant memory. Then he catches a sound upon the breeze, one which makes the smile disappear from his face, and his eyes grow wide. It is a soft but definite groan of pain, and it's followed by an awful meaty thwack that seems to reverberate in the air despite its faintness. Scott breaks into a run, rushing off of the road and toward the pond side, whence he's sure the sound came. Lying on his side in the growth of cattails and sedge, Ken's face is for a moment hard to recognize, the flesh around both eyes already starting to swell, and the area under his nose smeared with mingled blood and mucus. Vinnie Crail looms over him, aiming a kick at the prone boy's stomach, and Mac simply watches dully, a long, unfolded pocket knife held idly in one hand. Neither of them look up at Scott's approach, deafened by their own sadistic focus. It is only a matter of seconds, though it seems much longer, before Scott absorbs all the detail of this awful scene, and spots Boyd crouching further along the bank, pinning Amy beneath his weight as she attempts to crawl away. A flash of white-hot rage makes his vision momentarily swirl when he sees the top of her pale blue shirtwaist dress, torn and stained with the mud of the pond side, before his brain has made any conscious decision. Scott finds himself running toward Vinnie, drawing the bike chain from his satchel and dropping the ladder to the ground. Belatedly, Mac turns at the sound of Scott's footfalls, only to cry out in surprise and pain as the edge of the swung chain lashes whip-like across his face. Even as the larger boy stumbles backward, raising his forearms awkwardly to defend himself, Scott is drawing back and swinging again, and this time the chain leaves a long, jagged gash along the back of Mac's right hand, in which blood at once begins to well. Dropping the knife, Mac falls backward, screaming wordlessly, and Scott turns from him toward Vinnie, whose face is contorted with a toxic blend of shock and rage. Despite his own injuries, Ken is quick to take advantage of the distraction, and just as Vinnie decides to turn his attention to the newly appeared threat, Ken seizes a broken cottonwood branch from the ground, about 3 feet long and as thick as his wrist, and thrusts its splintered end upward at Vinnie's abdomen as if it were a sword. The sharp tip of the branch tears through Vinnie's stained plaid shirt and gouges a short, deep chasm in the soft white flesh of his belly, and Vinnie only has time to grunt before Scott's chain slashes his cheek. Driven by adrenaline, Ken leaps to his feet and now swings the branch like a baseball bat at Vinny's skull. The branch connects with a stomach-churning crunch and splinters into fragments, and Vinny falls face forward into the mud without another sound. Sparing each other only a brief look of mutual understanding, Scott and Ken turn as one to face the oldest Crail. But Boyd has given no thought to his brother's plight. It seems almost as though he has forgotten all but the struggling girl beneath him, whose dress is now ripped all the way down to the small of Amy's back. As he begins to move toward Boyd, Scott notes dimly in his peripheral vision that Ken is stooping to pick something up from the ground. Drawing near, he can hear now that Amy is not struggling silently. She is promising to kill Boyd and his brothers if they don't leave her and Ken alone, her blazing fury audible even through her insuppressible sobs of terror. Her courage, even in this moment of vulnerability, and the wanton brutality of the Crails, only swells Scott's deadly wrath. And this time he doesn't swing the chain at Boyd's exposed back, but wraps it like a garrote around his neck, and leans backward, supplementing his lesser strength with the weight of his body. Boyd's arms begin to flail, and he claws at his neck, trying and failing to pry his fingers under the chain. His face is already a deep red, turning toward purple, and seeing this fills Scott with a savage triumph, and he leans back even farther. Now Boyd allows himself to fall backward, freeing Amy, but also depriving Scott of all resistance, so that the latter too topples to the ground, painfully striking the back of his head against a gnarled cottonwood root. A starburst swirls in his vision, and a sudden nauseous vertigo renders him momentarily unable to find his feet. Boyd lies coughing hoarsely in the grass, spewing spittle and phlegm, a scarlet impression of the chain encircling his neck. Amy stands and begins to run toward the farmhouse. Scott tries even harder to regain his feet, afraid that Boyd will recover and chase her down. But his body seems unwilling to obey his commands. Then Ken staggers forward, Mac's pocket knife in his hand, and he falls on top of Boyd. The two bodies, disparate in size and build, but both weakened by the damages already inflicted upon them, struggle pitifully for a few seconds. Then Ken rolls over limply, and Boyd lies still, but for one hand stretched toward Scott, the fingers flexing rhythmically, as though appealing to his erstwhile attacker for help. Scott hears Ken vomit into the grass, and then he sees the handle of the pocket knife jutting from Boyd's neck, sees the pulsing stream of blood flowing down from beneath it to the earth. Scott tries to turn his head to see if the younger Crails have recovered, but his vision swims and blurs, and then darkness descends from the bright blue sky to swallow him. When he wakes, he's lying in a bed in a Spartan tiled room he does not recognize. The air is sharp with a chemical antiseptic smell, and he slowly realizes he's in a hospital. As he begins to sit up, his mother's face looms over him, and her hard-worked hands gently urge him back into a resting position. "Don't, honey," she says. "The nurse said you shouldn't move too much." He looks up at her and sees his father standing behind her, and cold terror floods through his body, along with the nightmarish memory of what happened beside McGullen Lagoon, knowing that some terrible reckoning must await him. And yet his father only comes forward to lay a gentle hand on his shoulder, and ask with unprecedented tenderness if he feels all right. At that, Scott tries to nod, but instead begins to cry, as freely and unabashedly as he has not done since he was a toddler. He spends 2 days in the hospital, as the doctors evaluate the concussion he took when he fell. The bicycle chain's lacerations to his palms and inner fingers, which he never even noticed, were cleaned and stitched while he was still unconscious. During those days, the sheriff and his deputies visit Scott several times, asking him seemingly endless questions, until he feels his wakefulness fading again, only to repeat the entire line of inquiry on the next visit. He discovers also that Ken is being treated for much more serious injuries in the next room, and despite the doctors' and nurses' assurances that they'll both be fine, Scott cannot rest until they allow him to visit his friend. Ken is dozing fitfully when he enters, his face now puffy and shining, and almost 3 times its normal size, blued with bruising. Mrs. Sugihara sits beside her son's bed and offers Scott a sad smile. Mr. Sugihara and Amy, she explains, have returned to the farm to tend the chickens and the pigs, who cannot be left unfed and without water for long. And he gathers that Amy escaped the event, without any harm beyond a few bruises and scrapes, at least physically. As Mrs. Sugihara talks, Ken's eyes flutter open. After a few moments, Mrs. Sugihara politely excuses herself from the room, claiming a need for something to drink, and leaves the 2 boys alone. Scott asks if he's okay, feeling stupid even as the words leave his mouth. Ken says that he's fine, obviously lying. A long silence stretches between them, and then Ken says brokenly that he thinks his sister is afraid of him now. Scott sees glistening tears pooling in his swollen eyes. "I killed him," he says softly, his voice cracking. And then he says no more, only continues to cry. And the image of the pocket-knife handle protruding from a ruined throat flashes once more through Scott's mind, and then is gone, replaced by the present reality of Ken's quiet anguish. "I killed him. I killed him. We both killed him," Scott says softly. He comes forward and takes Ken's hand, his own eyes wet now, and they weep together, without speaking another word. That is the last time that he and Ken ever share more than a few awkward exchanges. The 3 times they meet after that day, Ken is never able to meet Scott's gaze, and Scott knows that Ken sees not only the Crail boys in his face, but also that version of Scott that destroyed one of Mac Crail's eyes with a bike chain, and would have gladly strangled Boyd Crail to death if he hadn't been stopped. And maybe, too, Ken sees a reflection of himself that he does not like, the one that so frightened Amy. Before the next summer, the Sugiharas will have moved away, returning to the West Coast to rebuild their lives yet again. After Scott is released from the hospital, the sheriff comes to visit him and his family several times more. On the last such visit, Scott overhears the sheriff telling his father that it was only a matter of time until something like this happened. That ever since Willard Crail's death, his sons have only grown more and more lawless, having finally been freed from the tyranny of the only person they truly feared. And that is the last time the law darkens their doorstep, Scott and Ken never facing any legal repercussions for the events at McGullen Lagoon. After the 2 living Crail boys are released from medical care, which they received, Scott learns chillingly only after the fact, only a hallway away from the rooms where he and Ken recuperated, under constant police watch. They are sent to the boys' training school reformatory in Kearney, over 100 miles away. Mrs. Crail, seldom seen out of the house since her marriage, becomes now a total recluse, refusing to answer the door to any visitors, and will do so until her lonely death from stroke in 1965, only to be discovered days after the fact by the boy she pays to bring her groceries from town. As for Scott, he will never be able to recall most of the remainder of that summer break, which his family will tell him he spent mostly shut up in the bedroom he shares with Tom, lying and staring blankly at the ceiling. The one thing that will later stand out clearly in his memory is the evening, just a few days before the start of the next school year, that his father comes into the room to talk with him alone. His father doesn't really end up talking much at all, merely sitting silently beside him on Tom's lower bunk, and laying a calloused, strong tan hand upon his shoulder. And during the brief moment when their gazes meet and hold, there is a bone-deep, abiding sorrow in the older man's eyes. Scott does not see his father now, but an older version of himself, forever changed by the spilling of blood, forever bearing a rage that now has no object, and vague regrets for things that can never be undone, a shame that cannot be fully shared or even put into words. And no matter his age, he will forever mark that as the summer his childhood ends. If you enjoyed today's story, please rate, review, and share. If you're feeling particularly generous, you can support the show on the Patreon page at patreon.com/darkerpastures or at darkerpastures.buzzsprout.com. And for only $3 a month, you can unlock special subscriber-only content. Thank you for listening. We'll meet again in Darker Pastures.